My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
We need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
And today, in our boasted modern civilization, we are facing
Hello, and welcome to Diplomatic Immunity. I'm Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. To discuss the Biden administration's approach to trade, China, and technology policy, I spoke to three members of ISD's Board of Advisors. They helped us break down another crucial topic in American foreign policy. This episode is broken into three parts. The first two were recorded in early February, and the third was added more recently after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Wendy Cutler joined the Asia Society Policy Institute as Vice President and Managing Director of the Washington, D.C. office in November 2015. She focuses on building ASPI's presence in Washington, strengthening its outreach as a think, do tank, and on leading initiatives that address challenges related to trade and women's empowerment in Asia. She served for nearly 3 decades as a diplomat and negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR. Most recently, she served as Acting Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, working on a range of U.S. trade negotiations and initiatives in the Asia-Pacific region. In that capacity, she was responsible for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, agreement, including the bilateral negotiations with Japan. Ms. Cutler's other responsibilities with USTR included U.S.-China trade relations, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, and the U.S.-India Trade Policy Forum. She was the chief U.S. negotiator for the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement and negotiated a wide range of bilateral agreements with Japan on such issues as telecommunications, autos, and semiconductors. She is a graduate of the School of Foreign Service. Carolyn Brehm retired from the Procter & Gamble Company as Vice President for Global Government Relations and Public Policy, where she created and led P&G's team of 60 government relations practitioners based in key markets across the globe. She was responsible for public policy and legislative advocacy to protect and grow P&G's business, advising 3 company CEOs over her 17 years at P&G. She also oversaw a $24 million P&G fund supporting initiatives in the communities where P&G operates. During a 13-year stint with General Motors Corporation, Ms. Brehm served as Director of International Trade and Investment Policy, supporting GM's international operations. During 2 overseas assignments with GM, she established an office in Shanghai in 1984 to conduct counter-trade deals and returned to the region in 1996 as Director of Asia-Pacific Trade Policies and Strategy, supporting joint venture projects. She, too, is a graduate of the School of Foreign Service. Francine Lamoriello is Executive Vice President of Global Strategies for the Personal Care Products Council and directs all international activities and issues. Before that, she served as Senior International and Business Strategy Advisor at Baker Donelson PC, where she counseled clients on international business strategy and regulatory affairs and international trade policy. Previously, she served for 7 years as Director of International Trade and Investment Services at KPMG Pete Marwick, where she led international strategy and marketing studies for a wide variety of U.S. companies. She has also held positions at the U.S. Department of Commerce as Director of the European Community Single Market Program and specialized in U.S.-EU trade policy affecting technology companies. And she, too, is a graduate of the School of Foreign Service. Let's listen to the conversation. All right, well, Wendy, I think we'll start with you to kind of give us a little bit of a broad overview of sort of where the administration is on trade policy. And a big portion of their outlook on foreign policy writ large has been about a foreign policy for the middle class. And that's sort of the heart of their foreign policy. And what does this mean in terms of trade, and how is that tied into this issue?
Well, with respect to trade, the foreign policy for the middle class is really transformed in what is being called a worker-centric trade policy. And that means that the trade policy that both parties have been following for the past 70, 75 years called into question, and particularly with the view that it really hasn't served our workers and middle class. And so this administration has put a real emphasis on ensuring that the trade policies it pursues are beneficial to our workers and to the middle class, and frankly, has kind of tipped the balance against business as their trade policies have been developing. I think what they've found challenging, however, is that how do you translate this philosophy into practical initiatives? And we've seen some of that. I mean, for example, they are, with respect to stakeholder engagement, really stepping up their game, seeking input from labor, from NGOs, and other kind of underrepresented communities. They also are putting a big emphasis on enforcement, particularly enforcement of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which had extensive labor protection provisions. And they also are putting a spotlight on ridding our supply chains of products that use forced labor. So in those instances, I think we all understand what it means. I think where it's a bit still unclear, not only to us, but to our trading partners, is what does this mean with respect to pursuing trade agreements? Our trading partners just going ahead doing trade agreements, they're not waiting around for us. The U.S. is basically not pursuing new trade agreements. And even in the new initiative that they are developing now with respect to the Indo-Pacific, they've made it clear that they're not going to be offering market access to our trading partners, which for years has been the carrot to get our trading partners to agree to stronger worker rights provisions. And so, again, I think this is a work in progress. They have made some inroads, but I think that this concept of a worker-centric trade policy really needs to be fleshed out in more detail if it's going to be effective.
Yeah, and one aspect of all of this looming over all of the trade issues that are out there and that we'll discuss today as well is China. And Carolyn, you've had experience in China, and it's one of the underlying, China is one of the motivating factors in the administration's trade policy due to the geostrategic competition between the U.S. and China. So, from your experience, how have you seen the trade relationship with China shift over the previous decades?
Thanks, Kelly. As a young staffer at the U.S.-China Business Council in 1978, I first got my feet wet on U.S.-China relations. First trip to China was in 79 at the Canton Trade Fair, where there was virtually no trade between the two countries, and watched over 4 decades, basically, as the trading relationship grew and prospered. I worked for 2 major American companies that have done extraordinarily well in China, General Motors and Procter & Gamble, and watched the many ups and downs in the economic and political relationship over the years. Successful companies have, honed skills in managing these challenges, Tiananmen Square massacre and the sanctions that followed, the changes in the Chinese leadership, the political winds that have blown in both directions, and the reform efforts that the Chinese have tried to implement, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. China's accession to the WTO in 2001 was an extremely important step, in my view, and the right thing to do to bring China into the global trading community. And then there's a lot of things happened in the early 2000s, up in the 2010 and beyond, where China's rise was fairly rapid. I think the U.S. and the world's response to some of the actions that we were seeing from the Chinese side, unfair trade practices, the slow embrace of the commitments that they had made in the WTO agreement, were things that, in retrospect, we probably should have held China's feet to the fire much earlier on. But I would say I've done a lot of soul searching on this, because you look at where we are today as in the bilateral relationship. I don't know that I would have even ever dreamed that we would be in such a difficult and situation with so much animosity, so much tension, political and economic, and the national security issues that have trumped the trade and economic issues have clearly complicated the conversation. But where I come down is I am extremely concerned that in the growing nationalism and the conversation about China in the United States, we have really forgotten the important economic relationship that has grown up over this 40 years of trading, and that a couple of things. China's rapid growth has contributed enormously to drawing a lot of their people out of poverty, bringing them into the middle class and beyond, and improve the standard of living for hundreds of millions of Chinese. That is clearly something good for the globe, and not something that the United States should be concerned about. I would say, global companies, including many U.S. headquartered companies, have benefited enormously from this growth. China is the largest market, or the second largest market, for a very large number of Fortune 100 companies. And American shareholders, American jobs, American interests, economic interests have benefited from this. And it feels like that is not getting enough attention in this current environment. And long term, as we sort through these very difficult issues, China has got to, we've got to get China to a better place. And that requires dialogue. We've hardly had any. And what's very disturbing over the past year has been the lack of engagement. And it's come at the presidential level, at the USTR, foreign premier level, but incremental. And I don't believe there's the kind of dialogue at a number of levels in the government that's needed to get us to a better place. It's a really tough issue, and I think the U.S. over time continues to lose leverage in this bilateral relationship.
So I want to ask a quick follow-up to all of you before we get to your question, Francine, now that we're talking about China. And Wendy, you had mentioned and you had brought up supply chains. And Carolyn, you mentioned nationalism in the United States, but also, Chinese nationalism is rising as well. And, the issues we have of supply chains right now are also kind of going hand in hand with what we started to see under the Trump administration of a decoupling of the economies of the U.S. and China. And how do you see that playing out moving forward? These issues of supply chains, trying to correct for those issues, along with this decoupling that we've seen with China. Is that still happening in from what you've all been seeing? Where are we on that? Because I think that has is a dangerous thing, right? I mean, people talk about one of the main reasons that U.S. and China still will have a dialogue and a relationship moving forward is because of the huge amount of trade between the countries and how tied our economies are. But with decoupling, you risk taking that away.
Right. I would just say it was during the Trump administration's policies towards using tariffs as a tool to get China to address some of their unfair trade practices that really, I think, triggered the initial concerns and examination by American companies on how dependent they are on the Chinese supply chain. Then the pandemic came along and it exacerbated those vulnerabilities. So I think that there's been some very healthy readjustments that have happened with American companies now sourcing finding dual sourcing or multiple sourcing from different countries. And the beneficiaries of that are a number of other nations in Southeast Asia, Mexico, Latin America, whatever. I think those are all healthy things. But this notion of decoupling is, first, it's not realistic. And in it, to the extent that additional sources of supply for things like semiconductors do move forward, whether it's on, reshoring that capability in the United States, it's going to take years. So the kind of easy resourcing are the less capital intensive components and what have you, but the high tech sourcing is going to take a very long time. But I believe many companies are rethinking and actually have shifted strategies to become more resilient against these future disruptions. But I'd love to hear what Francine and Wendy have to say about that.
Well, I would agree. I think, though, I think it's an issue that we're facing not just with China, but with respect to global supply chains, and so not being dependent on any one source. And as the supply chain disruptions have continued through the pandemic, and costs have risen so much, you're really looking at companies even considering moving some manufacturing back to the United States, not perhaps for the reasons that the administration or due to tariffs, but due to just the costs and time delay as supply chains have broken down. So moving back to the U.S., some manufacturing or moving manufacturing closer to the U.S. But with respect to the decoupling of China, yes, on the sourcing side, perhaps on the third-party manufacturing side, there's a need to spread risk around throughout the world a bit better than relying only on one partner. But we can't forget the enormous size and impact of the Chinese economy itself, and especially for industries such as our sector, where we have such a large and growing consumer base in China. There is a need to make sure that you can serve that market. And so exports, but also manufacturing in China for the China market, I think, is something that hopefully will only grow. And in some cases, it won't make sense to decouple the supply chain as you're serving that market.
I think we'll continue to see this trend of what I would call selective decoupling, that in certain industries and certain sectors, companies and countries are just not going to want to rely on the other. And, this whole decoupling debate for me, it's two-way, right? It's not just the U.S. that was seeking decoupling. You can look back to China's initial Made in China 2025 plan. In some ways, that's a decoupling strategy because it's all about basically giving subsidies to the emerging industries. Why? So China would not have to rely on inputs and imports from other countries. And so, we now look at the dual circulation policy of China. That's in some ways a decoupling policy as well. But while all of this is happening, and I think Carolyn and Francine touched on this, our trade with China is exploding now. And, it's at new heights. So a lot of trade is going on. A lot of investment is still taking place, although we're seeing trends there not on the same trajectory as trade. And so I think we'll continue to see, we're not going to be able to undo all of those investment and trade ties. But I think over time, we're going to see, particularly again in certain sectors with respect to certain products, that companies and countries on both sides of the Pacific are going to do everything they can to diversify and to reduce their reliance on, one sole supplier, whether it be China, frankly, or even another source.
So when this episode gets released, the Olympics will have been over for about 4 or 5 weeks. But as we're recording this, the Olympics have just started. And, we've seen the human rights issues that have been ongoing, and the U.S. didn't send a delegation to China over their treatment of Uyghurs and other human rights abuses. And, we oftentimes talk about human rights and U.S. Policies towards countries and our actions with countries. But on the human rights issue, how do you balance that with economic goals of the U.S. government and in the interest of U.S. companies?
This is so incredibly tough, Kelly. And I, in some respects, am glad that I'm not sitting in either of the companies I used to work for and have to deal with this, because it is tough. And it really is brought to home when watching the national security crackdown in Hong Kong, where I lived for 3 years, and I have deep personal ties. It really came home to roost for me. What are the tools in America's arsenal to deal with these issues? And I think one of the things is we cannot do it alone. We have to do it with a coalition of like-minded allies in the global community, in order to be at all effective. If it's going to be sanctions, if it's going to be other ways to shame or pressure the Chinese to do things differently. But frankly, I don't think the U.S. has a lot of leverage. And American companies right now are being in a rock and a hard place. They can't speak out in China, and they can't speak out in the U.S. without getting punished in one place or the other. And at the end of the day, their reputations with consumers is on the line. It's a really tough question. I don't think there's no easy answers.
And I would just add, I think it's going to get tougher and tougher for U.S. companies exporting or operating in China, because the space between that rock and that hard place is going to get slimmer and slimmer. And what works for your stakeholders in the U.S., what works for your shareholders in the U.S. might not work for the Chinese authorities. And so a lot of companies now are frankly trying to just keep their heads down and continue to do business. But even that strategy may not work going forward when companies are caught between competing regulations and competing laws by both countries. Working with allies and partners is extremely important on the human rights front, but it's a huge challenge. Some of our allies and partners are willing to be out there with us. Others are a lot more reticent to take any kind of high-profile action. And I think just last week in the Japanese Diet, for one of the first times they came out with some kind of statement or resolution, addressing human rights in China. And it was so parsed down and the words were so carefully picked and had no real action behind it. And I think that just shows that while we have strong allies and partners in the region, a lot of them, for them, China is their closest economic partner. China is in their neighborhood. And so they feel that they need to be a lot more careful. And so I applaud the Biden administration for trying to work with allies and partners here, but I sympathize with them because this is really hard work on this front.
I think the only thing I'd add is that for companies, this is a longstanding question and tension. What do you do as a corporation who is seeking markets, seeking to serve consumers and customers around the world, not just in China, but in other places where human rights abuses are known? And it seems as though you could choose to disengage and or you can choose to engage, and there's no neither way seems to offer the solution of changing behavior necessarily. And so it really is quite difficult. And companies have obligations not only to their shareholders, certainly, but also to their own employees, both here and in the case of China, in China. And they have obligations to their consumers here who may have viewpoints about whether you should be doing business in China or other places, but they have obligations to their consumers in China too. And so every decision will have such long-term impacts that it must be taken very, very carefully. It is.
And immediate impacts as well.
Immediate impacts, but also, it's hard to reverse and undo reputational damage either one way or the other. Here for consumers who wish you to get out of China, for example, or with your Chinese consumers who wish for your support and tolerance, and it's very, very difficult to decide or to make a step that is going to actually have a positive impact one way or the other, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot of these issues are becoming a lot more high profile than we've seen in the past too, because you've had the issues of the NBA and their, what they've been doing with their Chinese market, with Hollywood, and the tech companies as well, and what they're willing to allow the Chinese company to say their companies can or can't do in China is something. These are types of things we're seeing a lot more of in the news. That was part one of our look at trade, technology, and China. Thanks for listening to this episode. Please share the episode on social media and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us wherever they listen to podcasts. Join us next time for part two, where we'll talk more about transatlantic trade, as well as the nexus of trade and tech. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. This episode was produced by Aaron Jones. Until we meet again.